Ep.2, and today I'm talking about Eros the Bittersweet by Anne Carson. Um, I have been going through the most intense Anne Carson phase. I had obviously heard of her before, but I'd never really read her. And then I think about a month ago, I read her book, The Beautiful Husband. I made a reel about that when I first read it. And even in the reel, kind of the major thing that I spoke about is how like every single page in my book is like annotated like completely, just because it was such an like crazy reading experience. I haven't read a lot of poetry, like apart from here and there. I haven't read like a book of poetry in a long time, so I thought part of it was that. But then I picked up her more famous book, which is the autobiography of Red, and I had pretty much the same experience for this one as well. And what I found really interesting in both of these books that I picked up of hers, I also read the Glass Essay, which is like a poem, a shorter poem of hers. What I found really interesting is that she has like the lightest touch. Like both of these works are in conversation with other authors. So she like quotes Keats between, or in before every tango. There's like 29 tangos in this book. She has like a John Keats quote, which like this book is kind of in conversation with that. And this book is based on a myth of Grayson. He's like this red monster in mythology, but then okay, I can't do this book justice in this video, so I'm not going to talk about it too much, but both of them are in conversation with other pieces of text. But what I liked about Anne Carson is that she has a really light touch, and she doesn't really like explain. She just kind of like throws you in the deep end, and then you kind of have to like understand it. And the pleasure of understanding her metaphors, and I'm sure so much of it has gone over my head. Like, I think it's one of those books that made me wish that I was in a class and someone was teaching this book to me so that I could like really get into each line and understand the context more. But just even what I did understand, the reason I was annotating the book so much is that it's such a pleasure to understand it, to bring these two disparate things together. And the reason I talk about that so much is Eros the Bittersweet is an essay. So it's different from the other two books, which are like poetry, like like they're books of poetry essentially. And when I was reading this, I was like, oh my god, now I know why she's so good at writing poetry. Okay, so what is the book about? It's about Eros, who's the god of not love exactly, but somewhere in that space. And we start off with this Sappho poem, and the question of why is Eros bittersweet? Like, it can, you think usually of love like it's just sweet, but I think anyone who's been in love, anyone who's read or like watched any movies about love knows that it's bittersweet. And like, why this contradiction and these two like kind of competing things coming together? Like, so that's our entry point into this investigation. And I'd just like to say, like, you usually think, like, if someone shows you a poem and then they explain it to you, you're like, oh, it could, best case scenario, it, like, slightly gives you a little bit of context and maybe improves your experience by, like, 5%. But worst case, usually it's extremely boring to have someone explain a poem to you. But to have Anne Carson explain a poem to you and explain a Sappho poem, I don't know if I'm saying that right, but anyway, it's unreal. Like, her understanding of language and metaphor and construction of poetry, like the sounds of it and stuff, it is mind-blowing. And I don't even think I was all the way through this book before I literally bought Anne Carson's other book, which is a collection of Sappho's poems. It's called If Not Winter, and I'm so excited for it just because I don't think I've ever had this experience of someone explain a poem and just completely like blow my mind about it, because I feel like I read poetry like fairly well, and then I was like, oh no, I can never read another poem without Anne Carson like sitting on my shoulder like explaining it to me. So Anne Carson sets up this like interesting construct, which is of a triangle, right? Usually when you think of love, you think of like a line, maybe like the lover and the beloved and like the connection between them. But here she says there's the lover, the beloved, and then the difference between them. So it's like a triangular formulation. I'm not going to be able to do justice in this video, but it's like a very interesting construct that we use throughout the book. So one of the central like ideas or the theses of this book is about Eros as lack, right? Which is very interesting, like especially in our day of like, oh, like you're already fulfilled and you don't need anyone but yourself and all of that stuff. This starts with the idea that Eros is specifically about lack. And if you like watch reels about like avoidant attachment and secure and whatever other attachment style, anxious attachment and stuff, it's going to be so interesting to read this because it's so unconcerned with that world of like defining desire in that way. And you see like all of those things of like anxious, avoidant attachment styles in the way that she describes Eros is something that is very like natural and very much a part of what makes it both pleasurable and bitter. So she like builds up this concept of edges, like the difference between you and me, the fact that we're both different people and we'll never be one person, and how that difference, that edge, is where Eros kind of comes in. Like you, me, and the difference between us are the three players in this triangle when we like talk about desire. And then, okay, it's so crazy. She like takes this concept and you kind of like you understand it in the context of love, and then she makes you understand it in the context of consonants and vowels, and makes you understand it in the context of like language and how the Greek language evolved. And it is so brilliant. You're like, it's so random, and I'm not going to be able to do it justice, but then when you read it in the book, you're like, oh, this is like one of those concepts that I never would have thought about in my life, but now that I have, I'm never going to be able to unsee it, because it's just so technically sound. So she makes you see like those edges and how language itself is a function of edges, and how people steeped in the written language, especially the written language in the way that we know it today with consonants and vowels and words and stuff like that, are steeped in edges. And maybe that's why Eros as lack is so central to our lives, and maybe that's why we even perceive it the way that we do perceive it, which I thought was like mind-blowing, especially as someone who's obsessed with reading and writing. Actually, a lot of this book has to do, like, it's about Eros, so about love, but it's also about like reading and writing and the delusion that is central to those activities, and how like, you know, sometimes with love we try to control love by like fixing people in a moment in time. Like you're like, I can fix him, like I know he was a good guy, so I know I can make him that good guy again, and all that stuff. It's especially interesting to me because my book, of course, is about a protagonist where like she lives in a world of memories, so she's literally trying to hold on to like a past version of this relationship and this person. So she talks about that aspect of control, and like, what does the lover want from the beloved is one of her questions. And then she also is like, what does the lover want from time, right? And it's to fix a living thing within time, which is inherently like a damaging thing to do. But then she also talks about how reading and writing are trying to do similar things. They're trying to like fix a living logos or like wisdom within like this non-living thing. And it's just so interesting because she's obviously a writer, and like whoever's reading it is obviously someone who like enjoys reading and writing a lot. So how she kind of draws those parallels. She also has this like entire section about metaphors and why metaphors are so satisfying for us to understand. And I was like, this is why you're the poet that you are. Like, it was so crazy. It was literally like having her explain her own work to me, and I was like, this is why your metaphors are so satisfying. Like taking two separate things and then bringing them together to see how, like, projecting sameness onto difference, I think is how she puts it. And it's just like the most satisfying feeling. She talks about how that feeling is so similar to the feeling of being in love with someone and seeing like this sameness being projected onto the difference of two different people, like you and your beloved. And it's like, right, like that actually is the same feeling. And I thought that was really interesting. Like, you know, you hear a lot about how we like intellectualize our feelings and stuff like that. That is something that I definitely do a lot, and it's kind of like pathologized. You're like, don't do that, you know. But she talks about how, like, so when there's you, the beloved, and the difference between you, she says Eros is lack, so it's always that motion of reaching towards, right? So that active imagination to reach out towards the beloved, that's kind of like the motion of Eros, and that's what makes Eros so satisfying as well. And she says that motion of reaching, you can call it longing, you can call it yearning, like all of these, like, you know, you can just see yourself like reaching out, right? She says that's the same motion that we have when we try to learn something, right? Like when you reach out from what you already know to like grasp new knowledge, that stretch of imagination is so similar to the stretch of imagination that you have to do like when you're falling in love with someone. And I was like, that's so true. Like that, just like thinking about it in those terms, I think was so interesting. And that's actually something that Anne Carson talks about a lot, like this active imagination that is so central to Eros. And like this is a concept that actually Arendt and Saint Augustine kind of talk about as well. Arendt talks about it in her book on Augustine, how like you can't desire something which you already have. Like desire has to come for something that you don't have already. So that like consummation, like not in the sexual context, but like consummation in the sense of like getting what you want, like the thing that you want becoming yours entirely, would destroy, it would suffocate Eros. Like Eros needs that perpetual motion of like reaching towards something and not fully having it, which I thought was really interesting. She talks about the novel form as well, right? Like novels that we read and stuff, and how like the beginning of a novel is like these two people and the difference between them, and the end usually is like them ending up together. But the course of the novel, what makes it interesting, the reason that we read these books, is because it's basically saying, but not yet. You know, the whole thing is an enterprise of like, we start from here, we kind of know where we're going to end, but we're not there just yet. And that not just yet, that motion of reaching towards it, is what is so pleasurable to us and to the lover and to the beloved. And that's where Eros kind of is, which I thought was so interesting to understand as well. So to kind of double click on this idea of imagination and how the reach of desire is an active imagination, that's something that she talks about. She says that union would be annihilation, right? Like when you have the lover, the beloved, and the difference between them, you have the possibility of Eros. But if both of them were to become just one, I'm not saying like coming together, because there's still friction between these two pieces, right? But like say they just were one. I'm not talking about like consummation in the sense of like you marry someone or you're in a relationship with them, because even in a relationship, even in a marriage, there is obviously like a difference and a distance between these two parties. But say that like, you know, there's that ancient Greek story of like the circular humans, and then they were split in half, right? And she talks about that story, and she says like, would we be ultimately satisfied if we were that one, like, you know, the two people joined together with two heads and stuff like that, but as one human? She says no, we wouldn't be satisfied, because in that story the round humans start rolling towards Olympus because they're seeking out the power of the gods. That's why the gods split them in half, to kind of give them something else to seek out apart from the power of the gods, right? So she said there was still Eros, there was still desire, but it was just not for each other, it was for the other, which was the power of the gods. And so she says like, desire, the forgetfulness of desire, is in a way like harmful, and that's why we're kind of like scared of it as well. Like she keeps talking about like the winged desire, like a winged god Eros and stuff like that, and how somewhere we are like a little afraid of Eros because it like changes us up, it takes control of us and things like that. And because we sense that if we actually got what we wanted from Eros, which was that ultimate union, it would be annihilating of the self that we currently are. it could be a really depressing idea to say that Eros is lack, and so that if you like become one, which is anyway impossible, but if you would, then there would be no Eros left. Or to be like, oh, so then I just have to be in this state of longing forever. But she says, like, if there was no difference, if there was no lack, there would be no difference. And if there's no difference, there's no movement towards, there's no reaching, there's no active imagination. And if there is not that motion of reaching, there's no delight of reaching as well. Because like getting to know something, getting to know someone, like that reaching action is where delight comes from, and that's where Eros comes from as well. So she said that perpetual motion doesn't just have to be tragic, it can actually be something that is the pleasurable part of Eros as well, right? Like that's why Eros is fundamentally bittersweet. Sally Rooney has this quote, and it's when her character Connell is like reading a lot of books. I think he's reading Emma, like from Jane Austen and stuff like that, and he's trying to understand why these are useful, and he realizes the same imagination that he uses to like understand literature is very useful in day-to-day life, because you need to imagine people to be able to love them, right? Like someone can like hand you water like while you're passing them, or they can be like, they can give you a call and just say something to you and stuff, and you get like 10% of the information from their actual action. But 90% of what we think, like, oh, they called me because they care about me and they want to know what I'm doing, or like they gave me this water because they want me to be hydrated, or whatever it is, all of that stuff largely is stuff that you're imagining about them, and you might be right. So you might not, you might be like, oh, I know them, but really you're like believing these things about them, and a lot of your belief could be justified, but you're not like verifying every single detail, right? You're like, sometimes you see someone sigh and you're like, oh, they must be tired, but you don't, like, maybe 50% of the time you'd be like, oh, are you tired? But like the rest of the time you wouldn't really do that. And then after they sigh, if they still like come give you like a foot massage or something, you'd be like, oh, they're tired and they still did this for me because they care for me. And then like these acts of imagination build up on themselves. And so the people that we love, like even when we're with them, are largely like people that we're imagining. And I think that's really interesting, because like when you break up with someone and you're like done with the relationship, so much of it is then about like, oh, you're like in a relationship with, like, or if you're like holding on to something, it's like, oh, you're just imagining this person, it's like a delusion. And it's like, no. And this is actually something Anne Carson says. She's like, every lover is a loser. Like I think she literally says that. I'll pull the quote up. She says, and basically what she's implying is that all lovers are unreliable narrators, because when Eros enters you, when you enter into love, you are mad. Like you're struck by madness. That's why people are scared of Eros, right? Because it is such a fragmenting experience, and the whole experience of reaching towards someone is an act of imagination. So it is an act of delusion. It's just that some lovers get broken up with and then they're like, but they were suckers to start with, right? It's just that some of them get left behind, and then it becomes a pathology versus just being like, it's okay because like they're still right next to you, even if you're imagining someone who's totally different from the person who's actually next to you, which I thought was really, really interesting. So yeah, that is my video on Eros the Bittersweet by Anne Carson.